Welcome to Heartbreak Chronicles. The afternoon sunlight spills lazily over the neatly manicured lawns of the suburbs, and the scent of grass and the faint aroma of barbecue coming from a neighbor's house floats in the air. Mark Davis is in his tidy garage, systematically organizing his electrician's tools. The shimmer of copper wire and the cold, hard texture of metal wrenches a world in his control, granting him a kind of solace that comes with order. This tranquility is shattered by the return of his wife, Isabelle. She held in her hand a pale envelope of expensive touch, and her face wore a carefully maintained calmness. But the knuckles of her fingers, which clenched the edge of the envelope and were slightly whitened by the exertion, were like a discordant note heralding some storm. Instead of giving him a hug or asking him about his day's work first, as she usually did, Isabelle just walked straight over and handed Mark that envelope, moving with a hint of imperceptible stiffness. Mark took the envelope and frowned at the heaviness of the paper and the vague scent of perfume on it. He could feel Isabelle's gaze deliberately avoiding him and turning in the direction of the living room. Their 15-year-old daughter Sophie was sprawled out on the carpet, flipping through a thick fashion magazine with rapt attention, letting out an excited whimper or two from time to time as she picked out the dress of her dreams for her Aunt Veronica's much-anticipated wedding party in a few weeks. Sophie's crisp discussion and vision of the future contrasts with the oppressive atmosphere Isabelle brings to the moment. A sense of foreboding swept through Mark's mind. Veronica, Isabelle's older sister who married into the family, never really hid her contempt for Mark, an ordinary electrician, and along with that, she was always scrutinizing and critical of Sophie. Mark didn't move to open the envelope. His movements deliberately slowed, his gaze sweeping over Isabelle's slightly nervous side. The cardboard inside was thick and cold, exuding an air of belonging to the upper class and rejecting the world. Elegantly written in a flowery script with carefully worded words, each twist and turn reveals a condescending arrogance. To Mark and Sophie, the letter began. Even the epithet carried a formulaic detachment regarding Veronica's upcoming wedding celebration. After careful deliberation within the family, we have decided to limit our guests to a strictly limited number of people who are more in tune with our family backgrounds, social circles, and lifestyles. We realize that this may come as a surprise to you, but we had to make this difficult decision in order to ensure the harmonious atmosphere and overall tone of the event and to avoid any potential discomfort or feeling of being out of place. Here's to understanding. The inscription is Veronica's name in print, cold and formal. Each word was like a needle hardened in ice, sticking into Mark's heart. This is not deliberation. This is notice. This is not regret. This is expulsion. In the most euphemistic terms, it expresses the most biting humiliation. A hot stream of mixed anger, humiliation, and intense disbelief shot up to the top of Mark's head, and he could almost hear his blood rushing. But he forced himself to take a deep breath and push down the churning emotions. Years of stoicism have taught him not to lose his cool around outsiders, especially in front of Isabelle's family. He lifted his head and gazed serenely at Isabelle, trying to find a hint of empathy or indignation in her face. However, all he saw was a complex and incomprehensible look. There was a flash of guilt, but more than that, an almost relieved sense of detachment that he couldn't decipher at the time. "Dad, the letter. Is it an invitation to a wedding?" Sophie heard the commotion and ran over like a happy bird, her eyes sparkling with anticipation, the magazine still clutched in her hand. "I've picked out 2 dresses. Can you help me see which one is better?" Mark quickly folded the piece of cardboard, a symbol of humiliation, and in one swift motion stuffed it back into the envelope, blocking Sophie's small, outstretched hand. "Well, it's a letter about the wedding." His voice was a few notches lower than usual, with a hint of imperceptible huskiness. "That's great. What does it say? When and where exactly? When can we go?" Sophie's barrage of questions came out like a barrage of questions, completely oblivious to the weirdness of the atmosphere. Isabelle seemed to want to open her mouth to say something, her lips moving, but ultimately, she just turned her head slightly sideways. Mark didn't give her a chance. He preempted his daughter by saying in a tone so calm that it was almost cold, "The letter says that there's been a change of plans on Aunt Veronica's end. This party is so small, we'll skip it." The smile on Sophie's face froze instantly, as if it were frozen. She looks at Mark in confusion and then at the silent Isabelle, her eyes full of hurt and disbelief. Why? We're a family, and I want to show Aunt Veronica the picture I drew. Her voice began to tremble and her eyes slowly reddened. Mark's heart felt like it was being clutched by an invisible hand. He squatted down and gently gathered his daughter into his arms, feeling her tiny body tremble slightly because of her aggravation. Sophie, listen to Dad. He tried to sound gentle and firm. Sometimes some people will measure others, even kinship, by money, status, or so-called standards. But that doesn't make us bad. Not at all. You and your dad were both really great. It's just that some people don't appreciate it. Remember? Never doubt yourself because of someone else's mistakes. He could feel his daughter burying her face in his shoulder, forcing herself not to cry out. But the silent protest and deep disbelief stung him like a needle. Isabelle stood still throughout, like a delicate bystander. She didn't defend her sister with even a word, nor did she come forward to comfort her obviously hurt daughter. She just turned around silently and walked to the other end of the living room and began absent-mindedly adjusting an otherwise perfectly placed decoration. Her silence, more than any words on Veronica's letter, chilled Mark to the bone. It wasn't just ostracism from his husband's sisters. It seemed to hide something deeper and more disturbing to him. He knew Veronica had always despised his background, but the sheer determination of the letter and Isabelle's unusual reaction at the moment was beyond his comprehension. In the days that followed, a heavy and oppressive silence enveloped the home that had once been filled with warmth and laughter. Mark didn't initiate the letter again. He needed time to digest the humiliation and watch Isabelle's next step. Isabelle also tacitly kept her mouth shut as if the letter never existed. But a rift has been created, like an invisible abyss between the couple, and it is silently widening. Mark is keenly aware of the many changes in Isabelle's behavior. She answered the phone significantly more often and always deliberately avoided him by walking out onto the balcony or locking her bedroom door. Her voice lowered to a whisper and her speech fast, occasionally interspersed with words he couldn't understand that seemed like nicknames. She began to return late more frequently on the grounds of working overtime, and sometimes even stayed out all night, reasoning that the project was urgent and needed to be in the company all night. She also began attending friends' meetings or industry seminars that Mark had never heard of, returning each time with a mixture of exhaustion and strange excitement. When Mark occasionally asked for details, her answers were always vague, with a twinkle in her eye, or simply, "You don't understand the intricacies of our industry." She also became more concerned about her appearance than ever before. Bought lots of expensive new clothes and makeup, got a more stylish haircut, and even started going to a fancy gym. At first, Mark tries to convince herself that it may have been the stimulus from that letter that made her want to seek some kind of affirmation by changing her outward appearance. But there were details he couldn't ignore. The occasional receipt for a restaurant or hotel purchase not known to him that appeared in her wallet. The occasional flickering previews of ambiguous messages from unfamiliar numbers that flashed across her cell phone screen. And, most disturbing of all, the lingering scent of an expensive and unfamiliar men's cologne he was unfamiliar with at times on her person. Mark is not a skeptic, and years of marriage have been built on trust. But all the anomalies in front of him were like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that were slowly coalescing in his mind, pointing to a possibility he was most reluctant to face. That letter from Veronica, like a fuse, ignites more than just a family conflict. It seems to ignite certain desires and resentments within Isabelle that he never knew existed. He forced himself to remain extremely calm and restrained. He didn't get hysterical with his questioning or sneak around and rummage through her personal belongings. He knew that any impulsive showdown before he had decisive evidence would only spook Isabelle and give her an excuse to weasel her way out of the situation or even turn around and accuse him of mistrust. What he needed was irrefutable truth, a sharp edge that could completely tear apart her disguise. Like a seasoned hunter, he began to observe, collect, and analyze without moving. The real breakthrough came on a seemingly normal rainy night. Isabelle dresses up and says she's going to an important client appreciation dinner at a new Michelin restaurant in the city center. She wore a new dress Mark had never seen before, and around her neck was a valuable diamond necklace he was sure he hadn't given himself. As she bent over to put on her shoes, Mark helped her pick up her handbag that was sitting on the foyer cabinet, and at that very moment, her cell phone screen lit up, and a message was clearly displayed on the lock screen. Honey, I've arrived at the old place. Can't wait to feel your temperature. Don't make our night wait too long. J. The capital letter J struck Mark's nerves like lightning. He instantly remembered the emails in Isabelle's mailbox labeled business collaboration, but signed Julian. The tone, designation, and content of this message certainly confirms that they are far from having an ordinary customer relationship. The old place? Feel your temperature? The words burned his eyes like a branding iron. Isabelle obviously saw it too. Her face changed slightly. She almost grabbed the phone, stuffed it into her bag, hurriedly said, "I'm leaving, don't wait for me," and disappeared into the rain as if she was running away. That night, Mark completely lost sleep. The rain pattered outside the window, like the cold liquid that kept dripping inside him. The J, the naked message, Isabelle's panicked reaction, and all the previous suspicions are now clearly connected in a sickening picture of betrayal. He could no longer fool himself. A strong gut feeling, mixed with anger and nausea, tells him that Isabelle's cheating has been going on for some time, and that the J is probably the source of her betrayal. At 3 a.m., Mark couldn't stand the inner torment any longer. He got up and walked to the study, where Isabelle's silverwork laptop sat quietly on the desktop. He knew the password to the boot, their daughter Sophie's birthday, a number that had once symbolized their shared happiness, but at the moment seemed ironic. His fingers hung above the keyboard as he engaged in a fierce internal struggle. Reason told him it was an invasion of privacy, a destruction of the bottom line of what was left of trust. But the anger of betrayal and the intense thirst for truth pushed him like a giant hand. Eventually, he entered the password. The screen lit up, the soft light illuminating his face, pale and haggard from anger and sleeplessness. The desktop background was still the same picture of their family on a sunny beach. Isabelle snuggled up next to him with a big smile. Mark's heart felt like it had been stabbed hard with a needle, and the sharp pain made him almost choke. With a shaky hand, he clicked on the email client. Instead of going through the seemingly normal work emails, he went straight to the folder named Private. He hesitated for a moment, as if about to open Pandora's box. Then he took a deep breath and clicked in. The number of emails inside wasn't huge, but the content of each one was enough to completely crush any hope Mark had left. The sender, without exception, was a man named Julian. The time span of the emails started a few months ago and became intense around the time of the humiliating wedding rejection letter. Isabelle, my muse, the time I spent with you last night was as intoxicating as a mellow wine. You radiate energy and intelligence with a passion I've never experienced in my dreary marriage. This is an older email with a flirtatious and seductive tone. My dear, there's no need to bother about that mediocre electrician and his unglamorous daughter. Veronica's decision, although in a poor manner, objectively clears the way for you and me. The future belongs to us, a world that is higher and more compatible with you. The date of the email, just 2 days after Mark received the rejection letter, confirms Mark's suspicion that Isabelle had knowledge of, and even acquiesced in, the contents of the letter. I've rented you an apartment with a view of the city skyline, a secret lair just for us. Imagine us there, far from the distractions of the world, with only each other. The email came with the address of the apartment, photos, and an electronic copy of the lease, although it was signed in Julian's company name. It was Isabelle's letter back that caused Mark to feel the most congenial sting. Her words are filled with dissatisfaction with her current life and longing for the future, as well as unabashed contempt for Mark. Julian, you were like a light that illuminated my dull, lackluster life. Yes, Mark is nice, but he's so ordinary, his world is so narrow that it takes my breath away. I deserve better. I deserve a man who knows how to appreciate me like you do. That letter. Perhaps it is indeed an opportunity. It hurts a little in the way, but the long pain is better than the short pain. I need to make choices for my life now, and I can't be dragged down by so-called family responsibilities anymore. The apartment was so beautiful. I can't believe it. I'm already imagining us setting it up together. Thank you, Julian, for making me feel cherished and desired again. Reading through one email after another, Mark's body shook violently with extreme anger and an unspeakable sense of betrayal. Turns out he's been living a big lie. His years of dedication, his sense of duty to his family, his forbearance to Isabelle's family, in her eyes, were just mediocre and a drag. Not only did she betray their marriage, but she even conspired with her lover to use the humiliating letter as a means of removing obstacles to their new life. Mark slammed his computer shut, the loud noise it made jarringly loud in the stillness of the late night. He felt a strong wave of nausea and rushed to the bathroom to dry heave. But nothing came out, only bitter bile rolling down his throat. He rinsed his face with cold water and looked at the man in the mirror with bloodshot eyes and a ghastly white face, and an icy, bone-chilling determination slowly coalesced in his mind. He will not be weak or back down again. Isabelle, Julian, and that high and mighty Veronica, this hypocritical, selfish alliance they've formed, must pay the heaviest price for what they've done. He wants more than a divorce. He wants revenge. He wants Isabelle to lose everything she holds dear: her lover, her social status, her smug sense of superiority, even her connection to her daughter. He was going to make her pay a price she couldn't afford for her betrayal and cruelty. He went back to his study, took out his cell phone, and dialed a number deep in the bottom of his address book. The phone was picked up after a few rings, and a calm, collected voice with the characteristic dryness of a soldier came through. "Mark? What's going on this late?" "Dave." Mark's voice was unusually calm, but underneath the calm was a suppressed wave of shock. "It's me. I need your professional help. Very important." He succinctly explained the situation to the former comrade in arms and now experienced private investigator, omitting emotional charges and focusing only on facts and needs. "I want that man, Julian Vance, the financial advisor, all the evidence of his inappropriate relationship with Isabelle. Photos, videos, communication records, financial transactions, same residence. Everything that could be presented to the court that would make him look bad, that Isabelle couldn't deny. I need the most detailed and irrefutable evidence. Money is not an issue." "Got it, Mark." Dave's voice remained professional and reliable. "Send me all the details you know. I'll use all my resources. Give me a moment." Hanging up the phone, Mark stood in front of the window. The rain had stopped and the outline of the city was becoming clearer in the morning dew. There was no longer pain or confusion in his eyes, replaced by an almost cruel calmness and determination. The plan for revenge, like a precise circuit diagram, began to outline itself in his mind, stroke by stroke. He knew it was going to be a tough fight, but he was ready for it. He would make those who had despised him and betrayed him pay an everlasting price for their arrogance and selfishness. And that coming Christmas will no longer be a symbol of family reunion, but his carefully planned Judgment Day. He would respond to all the harm they had inflicted on him and his daughter with a most complete destruction. Once the gears of revenge start turning, there is no turning back. Over the next few weeks, Mark's life went into a highly fractured state. He remains the same gentle, patient, all-powerful father to his daughter Sophie. He does her homework with her, listens to her talk about her school troubles, takes her for walks in the park, and tries to maintain the appearance of a normal, cozy family in front of her, even though he's already in shock inside. He knew that until the dust settled, he had to maximize his daughter's protection from the secondary damage of the dirty strife of the adult world. In front of Isabelle, Mark plays the role of a slightly distant husband who seems to be slowly getting over the wedding letter. He is no longer as reticent as he was before, and will occasionally take the initiative to talk to Isabelle about unrelated topics, and even expresses his understanding of her increasingly frequent overtime work and socializing. This apparent gesture of reconciliation succeeds in paralyzing Isabelle. She seems to think that Mark just had a bit of a falling out because of his bruised ego and is now slowly getting back to normal. At certain moments, she even showed an imperceptible look of pity, as if she pitied her mediocre husband, who was about to be abandoned by her, but was still in the dark about it. She was completely unaware of what flames of vengeance burned in the depths of Mark's calm eyes. Meanwhile, Dave's investigation proceeds covertly and efficiently. This former member of the Special Forces applies the skills of military reconnaissance to the work of a private investigator with great results. Not only did he quickly establish the fact that Julian Vance was married and the father of 2 children, But he also obtained a great deal of highly persuasive evidence through continuous tracking and surveillance. Dave sends Mark encrypted surveys on a regular basis. It began with blurry, long-distance photographs of Isabelle and Julian having dinner at various upscale restaurants, making intimate gestures and making eye contact, entering the Love Nest apartment building together, only to leave hours later, and whispering and embracing on secluded park benches. As the investigation deepened, the evidence became clearer and more damning. Higher definition, up-close photos and video footage, sufficient to recognize facial expressions, documented their kisses and more intimate gestures in hotel lobbies, parking lots, and even apartment hallways. Dave even manages to obtain, by means of some gray area maneuvering, some of the evidence of the interior of the apartment, not direct images, but such things as photographs of Isabelle's personal belongings left in the apartment, a silk scarf she always wore, a book she was reading, and an item analysis report of the apartment's garbage found with traces of both of their DNA. DNA traces of the items analyzed. The financial evidence is even more ironclad. Dave tracked down records of Julian's apartment rent and utility payments through his company account. What's more, he discovers multiple purchases made by Isabelle using the couple's joint credit card to buy expensive gifts for Julian, a valuable designer watch, the latest in electronics, and even a large purchase at a men's luxury store. The dates on these bills are an exact match to Isabelle's claims of overtime or travel. Isabelle not only betrays him emotionally, but she also has no qualms about financially appropriating property that belongs to them together to curry favor with her lover. What angered and disgusted Mark the most was the partial backup of text messages and social software chats that Dave had recovered through technical means. The contents were far more revealing and unsavory than the emails. Not only do they discuss their intimate relationship at length, but they also make fun of Mark for being boring, reserved, and awkward in bed with impunity. Julian even promises Isabelle in conversation that once he's done with his own wife and apparently planning a divorce, he'll give her a bigger, more glamorous wedding, a ceremony worthy of her status and tastes, with a disdain for Mark's current lifestyle. Isabelle responded with adoration for Julian and fantasies of the future, describing Mark as a stumbling block in her quest for true happiness. Each new piece of evidence he receives from Dave is like cutting a new wound in Mark's heart, but it also adds more fuel to his resolve for revenge. He compartmentalized, organized, numbered, and created multiple digital and paper backups of all the evidence, as if preparing for a crucial battle. He knew that these were not only proof of Isabelle's infidelity, but also a key weapon in his quest to regain custody of his daughter and gain a commanding advantage in the property division. He secretly consulted with the city's top divorce law firm. After carefully examining the prima facie evidence provided by Mark, the attorney gave a very clear legal opinion. While marital infidelity per se does not directly affect property division in their state, Isabelle's conspiracy with Julian to use community property to spend for the affair and Julian's use of a company account to pay Isabelle's apartment rent constituted a malicious misappropriation and waste of community property. As a matter of law, Mark is entitled to have Isabelle's misused share of the community property returned and to be compensated accordingly in the event of a final division. More importantly, Isabelle's deceitful behavior, her egregious conspiracy with her lover to ostracize her family, and the possible future revelation that she intended to abandon her family in order to unite with her lover would be extremely advantageous in the fight for sole or primary custody of Sophie. Judges prioritize the best interests of the child when determining custody, and Isabelle's behavior certainly shows a disregard for her family's responsibilities and her daughter's well-being. The lawyer advises Mark not to make hay for the time being and to wait for the most complete and irrefutable chain of evidence to be collected before acting in order to strike a blow. This coincides with Mark's thoughts. He wanted not an ugly tug of war, but a devastating quick-fire battle. Time slips closer to Christmas day by day, with Mark's motionless planning and Isabelle's unnoticed indulgence. Isabelle seems to be completely absorbed in her passionate love for Julian and her vision of the future, oblivious to the impending family storm. She even started hinting to Mark more frequently that she wanted to reconcile for Christmas and that she should go to her parents' house for a traditional family gathering, at least for Sophie's sake. Mom called again yesterday, in a much softer tone, and said that Veronica knows that the previous letter may have been a bit much. After all, we're family, so we can't stay frozen, can we? She said tentatively, with a hint of imperceptible superiority in her tone, as if she were doling out an offer of reconciliation. Mark looked at her and sneered in his mind. Reconciliation? After all that? He almost laughed at her hypocrisy and self-righteousness. But his face remained calm, and he even managed a tired smile. Isabelle, I appreciate your family's willingness to forgive us. But to be honest, after that incident, I always had a knot in my stomach. Besides, I've been working so much lately that I just don't have the energy to deal with all the complicated family scenes anymore. Let's have peace and quiet at home this Christmas. It's just the three of us, Sophie, you, and me. I guess that makes it a real family holiday, doesn't it? His tone was gentle, and his reasoning sounded reasonable. There was a quick flash of disappointment in Isabelle's eyes, perhaps disappointment at not being able to show off in front of her family that she was in control of the situation, but more of a relief. She probably figured that as long as Mark wasn't going to her house, she'd have more free time to date Julian, or at least avoid the embarrassment that might come from facing her family directly. She breathed a soft sigh of relief and nodded her head in agreement. All right, if you insist. I'll explain it to Mom. She was completely unaware that she had stepped into a trap that Mark had carefully laid out for her. Mark is all about setting the stage for judgment in a home that she once considered a haven, but is now filled with signs of her betrayal. A week before Christmas, everything was ready. Mark took a day of annual leave. He went to a professional print and bindery store downtown and assembled all the evidence, including high-resolution photographs, screenshots of emails and text messages, copies of apartment leases, detailed credit card statements, summaries of DNA forensic analysis, and even a transcript of a phone call in which Dave managed to get Julian to brag to a friend about how he got Isabelle and how he planned to get rid of his wife, into 3 identical, beautifully framed reports. Even a transcript of a vague recording that Dave managed to obtain of Julian bragging to a friend on a phone call about how he had fixed Isabelle and was planning to get rid of his wife, into 3 identical, beautifully framed reports. Each report is wrapped in a thick, dark cover that looks like an important business document. He left no trace on the report or the envelope that could be traced back to himself or Dave. He then drove to 3 courier service points in different parts of the city to send the 3 heavy Christmas gifts anonymously. The recipients were Veronica Linsington, her husband's last name, and Isabelle's parents, Arthur and Clara Miller. He purposely chose a timed, expedited service that could deliver around 5 p.m. on Christmas Eve. By that time, he calculated, members of the Miller and Linsington families were probably gathered at Veronica's mansion overlooking the city at night, mingling, enjoying their self-proclaimed elite holiday dinner, and probably talking contemptuously about the Mark family's absence and lack of respect. He could almost imagine what a wonderful picture it would be when the 3 packages were unwrapped and their contents made public. He's going to make this hypocritical feast, at its most hilarious climax, instantly turn into a scandalous launch that's exposed to the spotlight. On Christmas Eve, Mark was busy around the house like a dedicated husband and father. Together, he and Sophie had elaborately decorated the Christmas tree with colored lights and hanging ornaments, and the scent of pine needles filled the air. He had prepared a sumptuous dinner, and the smell of roasting turkey filled the house. Isabelle seemed to get into the holiday spirit as well, wearing a cozy cashmere sweater and even offering to hum Christmas songs and help set the table. She looked relaxed and happy, perhaps because she finally didn't have to deal with the family members who were stressing her out, or perhaps because of the anticipation of a possible date with Julian later in the evening. Only Mark himself knows what destructive forces are about to erupt underneath this moment of warmth and calm. He was waiting, like for a precise surgical operation. He mentally counted down the time. At 4:50 p.m., slightly earlier than scheduled, the doorbell rang sharply. Mark's heart missed a beat, but his face remained calm. He wiped his hands and walked over to open the door. Instead of the expected courier, Dave stood in the doorway, his face unusually grave. Mark, Dave's voice was low and urgent, with a hint of apology. Something's wrong. There's been a change of plans. Mark's heart sank hard. What's going on? I just got a tip-off, Dave said quickly, that all three of those packages you sent to Veronica and her parents were intercepted at the last stage of delivery. Someone over at the delivery address said hello in advance, and the courier didn't even manage to get the stuff in. What? Mark was shocked. Who did this? 9 times out of 10, it's Julian Vance. Dave's brow furrowed. This guy is very alert and well-connected. He may have sensed the risk in some way, or simply used his connections in the logistics or security systems to set up an interception in advance out of an abundance of caution. We underestimated his energy and reaction time. Mark felt a chill rise from the soles of his feet. The first step of his elaborate plan, the one he had high hopes for, to detonate a bomb in the heart of the enemy, turned out to be a last-minute failure. Julian is not only cunning, he's crafty. Not only does he betray his marriage, but he also has a powerful ability to protect his secrets. Not only that, Dave's face hardened. But my people have intercepted some information that Julian seems to be aware that someone is investigating him and is preparing to fight back. He contacted his attorney and is gathering evidence against you, most likely fabricated, such as allegations of emotional instability, controlling, or even domestic violence tendencies. He's trying to preempt the divorce proceedings by portraying you as the party at fault as a way to protect his property and reputation, and maybe even affect Sophie's custody. Mark's fists clenched momentarily, his knuckles white from the effort. Good one, Julian. Not only did he ruin his plans, but he had to be evil and backpedal. He also contacted Isabelle, Dave added, seemingly trying to force her to cooperate and work together to make up lies against you. He may also have something on Isabelle in his hands that he's using to threaten her into submission. I hadn't counted on the other side being so insidious and swift. Mark felt a pang of fear. If he had followed the original plan and simply waited for the effects of the package to be delivered, he might have been in a passive position by now, or even been bitten back by the other side. Luckily, he had a backhand. Luckily, all the evidence is still in his own hands. I know, Dave. Mark took a deep breath, his eyes becoming cold and sharp. Thanks for telling me in time. Looks like I'm going to have to change my plans. Since she couldn't be publicly executed in their arena, she was given a more direct and private trial in this home where she thought she was safe. He closes the door and turns toward Isabelle, who is setting out the candles, with an inscrutable calmness on his face. Isabelle seemed to sense something and looked up at him with a hint of inquiry in her eyes. Dinner is ready and fragrant. Roast turkey, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. All traditional Christmas dishes. Sophie sits excitedly at the table, looking forward to feasting. Isabelle sat down as well and picked up her napkin. Mark didn't take his seat. He stood at the main table, a bottle of red wine in his hand. He started by pouring Sophie a full glass of her favorite apple juice, then poured red wine into the glasses in front of Isabelle and himself. Before we enjoy this cozy Christmas Eve dinner, Mark's voice was calm, but with an undeniable penetration that echoed clearly through the dining room. I think we have something very important that we need to talk about openly and honestly. Isabelle's hand, which was about to pick up her knife and fork, froze in midair, and the smile on her face disappeared in an instant, replaced by a look of mingled panic and disbelief. Mark, what do you want to talk about? It's Christmas Eve. I know. Mark interrupted her, his tone turning cold and harsh. A Christmas Eve full of lies, deceit, and betrayal. Before the words were out of his mouth, he slammed a thick bag of papers that had been sitting on a nearby chair down in the center of the dining room table. The bag opened, and the papers, photos, and bills inside poured out like a sudden windstorm, instantly sweeping across the carefully set table and scattering among the delicate china plates, gleaming silver flatware, and cozy Christmas decorations. Those high-resolution, unflattering photos, those printed emails and text messages full of taunts and calculations, those credit card bills clearly labeled with large purchases. Like the ugliest filth, it taints the false holiday spirit. Sophie looked in horror at the photographs scattered on the tabletop, and while she might not have been able to fully comprehend the meaning of the words, the pictures of her mother in overly intimate gestures with a strange man embracing, kissing, snuggling were enough to make her pale little face to lose its blood color instantly. Her eyes filled with tears and her small hands covered her mouth tightly, unable to make any sound. Isabel's face, on the other hand, turned as white as paper in an instant, as if the blood had been drained from her entire body. Her eyes widened in horror as she looked at the documents scattered in front of her like incriminating evidence, her body trembling violently, her lips quivering, but she couldn't say a word. "Mark, where are you from?" She finally squeezed out a few words, her voice hoarse with incredulous fear. "Where did I get that?" Mark let out a short, icy laugh that was filled with endless sarcasm and suppressed anger. "I should ask you, Isabelle. Julian Vance, is it? Is this the true love you seek even after betraying your family and abandoning your daughter? Is this the man who made you think you could get rid of my baggage of mediocrity and move on to a higher life?" He picks up a picture of Isabelle and Julian being affectionate and feeding each other in a fancy restaurant and slams it down so hard on the plate in front of Isabelle that the sauce splatters. "No, it's not what you think. Mark, please let me explain." Isabelle finally erupted, screaming, her hands haphazardly trying to gather the papers on her desk, trying to hide the incriminating evidence. "It was Julian. He seduced me. I was just confused. I never wanted to leave you and Sophie. Really." She began to argue incoherently, tears rolling down her face like broken beads. A moment of confusion. Mark's voice rose steeply, filled with long pent-up anger, and he slammed the table, the heavy solid wood dining table making a loud rattling sound, and the cups and plates on the table shook with it, making a piercing clattering sound. Sophie shuddered in fear and let out a suppressed whimper. "You rented an apartment with him to live together as a moment of weakness. It was a moment of weakness for you to buy him thousands of dollars in watches and the latest cell phones with our hard-earned money. Is it also a moment of confusion for you to mock me in emails and text messages and to calculate how you will throw me away like garbage?" He pressed on, picking up a printout of text messages that clearly documented how Isabelle had complained to Julian about Mark's uninteresting and unromantic nature and how she was looking forward to getting out of this suffocating marriage. "Look at your own words, Isabelle. Is that what you call never wanting to leave?" And Mark didn't give her any chance to catch her breath. He knew that when dealing with such a selfish and hypocritical person, he had to break down her mental defenses once and for all. "Do you think your good lover Julian really loves you? Do you think he'll throw it all away for you?" He took out his cell phone and pressed play. The recording Dave intercepted earlier came out of the cell phone. After processing, Julian's voice is clearly recognizable. He was on the phone proudly bragging to his friends about how easily he fixed Isabelle, a passionate middle-aged woman, and how he plans to put the blame on Mark in the event of a divorce, and even implied that he holds some of Isabelle's leverage to ensure that she will cooperate. He even suggests that he has something on Isabelle to make sure that she will cooperate. The recording wasn't long, but every word was like a heavy hammer, hitting Isabelle's heart hard. She stared incredulously at Mark's cell phone, the blood completely fading from her face, her eyes filled with despair, fear, and shame at having been so thoroughly used. "No, it's not true. He's lying." Her voice was weak as a mosquito hum. "You know in your heart if he's lying." Mark put away his cell phone, his eyes as cold as Siberian ice. "People like you always put your own interests first. He uses you to fulfill his desires, and you use him to fill your supposed emptiness and greed for material things. You're just using each other, one and the same. Now the game is over, Isabelle." He stopped looking at Isabelle, who was slumped in her chair, as if all her strength and soul had been drained from her in an instant. He walked over to Sophie, who had long since been shaking with fear and tears, knelt down and wiped the tears from his daughter's face with a trembling but as gentle a hand as he could muster. "Sophie, my baby, I'm sorry." His voice choked. "Daddy's sorry you had to see such an ugly sight. It's not your fault, ever. Daddy promises that from now on, I will never let anyone hurt you again, never." He took off his own jacket and wrapped it tightly around his daughter's cold little body, then scooped her up by the waist and walked out of the restaurant that had once symbolized home, but was now nothing but betrayal and lies, without looking back. Behind him, there was the sound of Isabelle's hysterical cries and slamming things, but Mark didn't turn around. His footsteps were firm and heavy, and each step felt like a complete goodbye to the past. This Christmas Eve, there is no salvation, only judgment. And he, at last, has reclaimed for himself and his daughter the dignity and future he deserves. Early the next morning, at the crack of dawn, Mark left the hotel with Sophie and headed straight to the law firm where he'd already made an appointment. He handed over the entirety of the organized, hundreds of pages of evidence, including the recording of Isabelle's meltdown last night. He was immobilized with his phone's recording feature turned on, as well as the most recent, circumstantial evidence provided by Dave about Julian's attempts at obstruction of justice, stopping packages, plotting to plant evidence, to his team of lead attorneys. After a quick review of the core evidence, the legal team applauded Mark's determination and thoroughness in taking evidence and immediately initiated the fastest possible legal process. Like a series of precision-guided missiles, the divorce complaint, the property freeze petition, and the petition for sole legal custody and primary life support of Sophie, based on Isabelle's gross negligence and trauma to her daughter, were served on Isabelle and her temporary residence on the first business day after Christmas. She had, after that night, Mark changed the locks on the door and could no longer enter what was once her home. The news exploded like a bombshell in the self-proclaimed sophisticated upper-class social circle to which Isabelle and Veronica belonged. At first, Veronica tried to use her family connections to suppress the news and claimed that Mark was slandering her because he couldn't accept a peaceful breakup. But the tide turned when Mark's attorneys inadvertently leaked some of the key evidence. The most intimate parts of the case were withheld, but enough to prove the core facts. Through legal channels to a few local news-following media outlets and social media celebrity bloggers, Isabelle maintains a long-term illicit relationship with a married man, Julian, conspires to ostracize her family, squanders the couple's joint fortune to please her lover, and even tries to cooperate with her lover to plant evidence against her husband when the betrayal is discovered. These details were added to and spread, becoming the biggest scandal and laughingstock in the circle. Veronica's wedding, which had been highly publicized, was overshadowed by a thick shadow, with many of the scheduled important guests reportedly declining to attend for a variety of reasons. Veronica was so furious that in an attempt to clear the air, she publicly announced that she was cutting off all contact with her sister Isabelle, suggesting that Isabelle may have serious psychological problems. Isabelle's parents, Arthur and Clara, also chose to remain silent under the enormous social pressure and the blow of losing face, completely abandoning the daughter who had disgraced them. Julian Vance is having an equally hard time. Mark's lawyers not only sent copies of the evidence to his wife, but also anonymously reported it to the headquarters of his financial advisory firm and to industry regulators for improper business practices and moral hazard. Julian's wife immediately filed for divorce and hired a strong team of attorneys to divide property and fight for custody. His company also promptly launched an internal investigation into him, suspending him from all positions. The formerly glamorous financial elite was plunged overnight into the desperate situation of broken families, collapsed careers, and notoriety. He was so anxious that he had already thrown Isabelle's trouble out of the window. The divorce proceedings went exceptionally well. Faced with mountains of hard evidence, Isabelle's attorneys had few effective defense strategies. In court, Mark remained calm and restrained while his attorney methodically presented the evidence, clearly stating Isabelle's faulty behavior and the serious harm it caused to his family and daughter. That recording of Isabelle's post-breakdown and Julian's attempted planting of evidence, in particular, raised serious questions for the judge about Isabelle's character and integrity. The final verdict was exactly what Mark expected and even better than expected. The judge awarded sole legal custody, and primary physical custody of Sophie to Mark in its entirety, with Isabelle receiving only extremely limited and supervised visitation rights. In terms of property division, the judge, taking into account Isabelle's malicious misappropriation and wasteful behavior with respect to the community property, as well as the fact that her infidelity was largely responsible for the breakdown of the marriage, ruled that not only was Isabelle required to return her abusive share of the community property, but that she would be entitled to far less than 50% of the division of the remaining community property. This means that Isabelle is pretty much a clean slate, losing everything she once had in terms of material foundation. On the day the verdict was handed down, Isabelle lost her temper outside the courtroom and tried to rush up and tear Mark apart, swearing vile words, but was stopped in time by the bailiff. Mark just gave her a cold look, no ripples in his eyes, then took Sophie's hand and calmly left the courthouse, escorted by his lawyer. He knew that, in this battle, he had won. A few months later, Mark sold the house that held so many painful memories and moved with Sophie to a beach town with a pleasant climate, far away from the turmoil of the past. He used the divided property, together with his own savings, to open a small electrical engineering company, and with excellent skills and honesty, the business was soon on the right track. Sophie also transfers to a new school, and with the help of a psychiatrist and her father's unfailing love and care, gradually comes out of the shadow of her parents' divorce and her mother's betrayal and becomes cheerful again. While that experience left an indelible mark on her heart, it also taught her the complexities of human nature and the importance of self-protection much earlier than her peers. Occasionally, Mark would hear about Isabelle sporadically from some old acquaintance. It is said that she had to move to a remote town and work odd jobs to make ends meet because she could not find a decent job and her reputation was ruined. Her family never contacted her again, and Julian has long since disappeared from her life. Once, a former neighbor ran into her at the supermarket and described her as withered and bleary-eyed, a far cry from the scantily clad, glowing Isabelle of the past. Mark heard the news without a ripple in his heart. There was no sympathy, no pity, and no gloating. He was just more convinced that he had made the right choice in the first place. For those who wantonly trampled on the feelings and dignity of others' betrayer, any form of forgiveness is to their own cruelty. Perhaps the best education for them is to let them face the cold reality alone in the bitter fruits of their own making. As the sun set, the golden afterglow spilled over the sea and the waves sparkled. Mark stood on his balcony and watched Sophie run and laugh happily on the beach with her newfound friends. The sea breeze blew against his face with a hint of salty freshness. It was as if the gloom of the past had been completely blown away by this sea breeze. He knew that there was still a long road ahead, but he had already rebuilt a safe, warm, hopeful harbor for himself and his daughter. And those who have hurt them will pay a long and heavy price for their choices, long and hard, in the shadows far from their sight. There is no forgiveness in this ending, only karma. That's the end of today's story. For more captivating tales, hit subscribe and never miss an episode.